The war in the Pacific was young, brutal, and merciless when Major Jack Grayson arrived at Charters Towers Airfield in the dry heart of Queensland, Australia, in 1942. The air shimmered with heat, and the smell of oil and dust hung in the air like a second skin. Men called him Pappy, not because of his age, but because of the way he carried himself. Calm in the storm, steady in chaos. He had been a mechanic before the war, a blacksmith's son from Arkansas who could bend steel like others bent words, but the war had taken everything from him except his craft. When the Japanese seized Manila, his wife Clara and their 4 children were trapped and sent to the Santo Tomas internment camp. There were no letters, no hope of rescue, only the echo of their names carried by the radio static that whispered news from a continent away. Most men would have broken. Grayson built. When the Japanese took his family prisoner in Manila, one pilot recalled, he didn't write letters. He built weapons. The Allied campaign in New Guinea was collapsing under a wall of jungle and mud. Bombers designed for clear skies and open fields found themselves useless under heavy clouds, their payloads scattering harmlessly into trees and rivers. From 12,000 feet, the enemy was invisible. From the ground, they were unstoppable. Grayson watched the reports come in. Lost aircraft, missing crews, supply convoys slipping through Allied lines because the Air Force couldn't strike low enough to matter. To him, the problem wasn't strategy. It was engineering. He walked through the airfield's boneyard one night, where broken aircraft lay like the skeletons of extinct beasts. The moonlight glinted off bullet holes and twisted propellers. Somewhere between rage and revelation, he muttered the words that would define his legacy. If we can't bomb them from above, we'll burn them from below. In those words lived both a promise and a warning. He began working after dark, long after the mechanics had gone to sleep. With a wrench in one hand and a cigarette burning down to ash in the other, he stripped down wrecked planes, P-40s, A-20s, anything with usable metal or guns. Each bolt removed was an act of defiance. Each spark from his torch a prayer whispered into the night. Men whispered that Pappy was going crazy. Others said he was chasing ghosts. They weren't entirely wrong. What drove him wasn't duty or ambition. It was desperation. Every aircraft he touched, every weapon he modified, was built on one thought. If he could make the war shorter, maybe his family would live long enough to see it end. Charters. Towers became his forge, and the airfield his anvil. When dawn came, the sun lit the curved sheet metal of his workshop like molten steel. Officers tried to stop him. Modifications needed approval, they said. He ignored them. Paperwork didn't win battles. Ideas did. And Grayson's ideas were dangerous. He envisioned a bomber that didn't hide above the clouds, but screamed just above the treetops, low enough for the enemy to see its teeth. A bomber that wouldn't drop its bombs from miles away, but would tear through convoys and airfields with the fury of a gunslinger. The standard manuals had no place for that kind of aircraft, but war rarely waits for permission. Grayson was crafting something a factory could produce. A weapon born of grief, ingenuity, and a blacksmith's hands. Late one afternoon, he stood beside an abandoned A-20 Havoc light bomber, its glass nose shattered, its engines silent. He ran his hand across the fuselage, feeling the cold metal under his fingertips, and whispered as if speaking to his own creation, "You and I were not done yet." That night, sparks flared from his hangar, lighting the Australian sky like a welding torch against the horizon. Men passing by saw the silhouette of a lone figure working under the glow, sleeves rolled up, face streaked with grease, eyes fixed on something that didn't exist yet, but soon would. "The old man's lost it," one mechanic muttered. "Maybe," another replied, watching the light flicker. "Or maybe he's about to change the war." By dawn, the framework of something new sat in the hangar. Crude, ugly, and dangerous. It was no longer a bomber. It was something else entirely. His first experiment looked insane, but within 24 hours, that madness would set the Pacific sky on fire. The dawn after his long night in the hangar broke red across the horizon, and Major Jack Grayson stood staring at what he and his crew had built. The plane looked like a patchwork beast, its sleek bomber nose replaced by rough steel panels bolted together with visible seams. 4 salvaged Browning .50 caliber machine guns jutted out from the front like clenched fists. The A-20 Havoc had been reborn, not as a precision bomber, but as something no manual dared imagine, a low-flying predator built to rip through the jungle air. Grayson's hands trembled slightly, not from fatigue, but from the enormity of what he was about to do. This wasn't a sanctioned project. There was no blueprint, no test approval, and certainly no blessing from command. Just the conviction that desperate wars demanded desperate machines. Standing beside him was Robert "Scotty" McLeod, a wiry Australian engineer who had once fixed crop dusters before the world caught fire. "You're sure she'll fly?" McLeod asked, wiping sweat from his brow. "She'll fly," Grayson muttered, tightening a bolt with one last twist. "I just don't know what she'll do when she gets angry." By mid-morning, the airfield was alive with whispers. Mechanics leaned on wrenches and watched as the strange modified Havoc was wheeled toward the runway. Its patched aluminum gleamed under the sun, the 4 gun barrels black as the mouth of a tunnel. No one said it aloud, but every man on that tarmac felt they were about to witness something either brilliant or fatal. Grayson climbed into the cockpit, his knuckles white on the control column, the smell of fuel and gun oil thick in his nose. Engines coughed, then roared. Dust whipped across the field as the A-20 rumbled forward. It lifted, reluctantly at first, then with growing confidence, the ground dropping away beneath its wings. The first monster had taken flight. From above the tree line, the Pacific stretched out like a mirror, reflecting both beauty and threat. In the distance lay their target, the Japanese airfield at Buna, a small coastal strip bristling with aircraft and fuel dumps. It was there that Grayson's creation would either prove its worth or fall flaming into the sea. Flying low, the Havoc thundered over the jungle canopy, treetops bending in its wake. At barely 200 feet, it approached the target faster than the defenders could react. The moment the airfield came into view, Grayson squeezed the trigger. The 4 machine guns erupted in a solid line of fire, cutting across the field with an unbroken scream. The first bursts chewed through hangars, tore into parked aircraft, and exploded fuel barrels into towers of flame. Anti-aircraft gunners scrambled, but their fire went wild, blinded by smoke and shock. In less than a minute, the airfield dissolved into chaos, ammunition cooking off, planes burning, the jungle echoing with the sound of .50 caliber thunder. Grayson pulled up sharply, the plane shuddering under the recoil, his face lit orange by the inferno below. Back at base, silence greeted the returning Havoc as it taxied to a stop. The fuselage was blackened with soot, and bullet holes peppered its sides. Grayson climbed down, his flight suit reeking of cordite, eyes still fixed on the horizon. McLeod ran up to him, half laughing, half crying. "You mad bastard," he shouted over the fading engines. "You actually did it!" Before Grayson could answer, a jeep skidded to a halt nearby. Out stepped General George Kennerly, commander of the 5th Air Force, a tall man with silver hair and a reputation for breaking rules when the rules got in the way of victory. He walked around the scorched Havoc, ran a finger over one of the blackened gun barrels, and looked up at Grayson. "You just turned a bomber into a shotgun," he said quietly. A hint of disbelief and admiration mingled in his voice. "Where did you even get the guns?" Grayson wiped his hands on a rag. "From wrecks. There's a graveyard full of them. Might as well make the dead useful." Kennerly let out a low whistle. "And the results?" Grayson glanced at McLeod, then toward the smoke rising far to the north. Let's just say Buna won't be sending any planes south for a while. Reports confirmed it. The raid had destroyed nearly every Japanese aircraft on the ground. Fuel depots and supply caches had burned for hours. It wasn't just a tactical win. It was proof that the air war in the Pacific could change shape overnight. The brass back in Brisbane called it reckless improvisation. Kennerly called it genius. "You've just given us a way to fight back," he told Grayson. "Now let's see how far you can push it." Within days, new requests poured in. Could he do the same with larger bombers? Could he make something that not only strafed airfields but annihilated convoys? Grayson's hangar turned into a laboratory of controlled chaos. Sparks flying, men shouting, old engines coughing back to life. His Frankenstein workshop, the crews called it. To Grayson, it was salvation. Every rivet he hammered, every weapon he mounted, was one step closer to bringing his family home. At night, he wrote in his logbook, not about victories or losses, but about ideas. "Guns forward," one note read. "Speed low. Impact immediate. Fear psychological." He wasn't just modifying planes. He was rewriting the psychology of air warfare. For the first time, Allied pilots began to talk about fighting from below the clouds, about attacking ships at wave-top height, about taking control of the skies not by altitude, but by audacity. Yet Grayson knew what he'd done was only the beginning. His first monster had proven that innovation could be built from scrap metal and rage. But what he envisioned next would test not just the limits of machinery, it would test the limits of belief itself. The test worked, but what Grayson planned next would defy every rule of aeronautical design. The A-20 Havoc had been a proof of concept, a wild, sleepless experiment that turned into fire and victory. But for Major Jack Grayson, it wasn't enough. The Japanese still ruled the seas with convoys that slipped through at night, bringing troops and supplies to the front. The Allied bombers, flying high and slow, could barely touch them. Grayson needed something bigger, faster, and deadlier, something that could fly low enough to see the enemy's eyes before pulling the trigger. His answer lay in a machine he already knew by heart, the North American B-25 Mitchell. The Mitchell was no lightweight. It was a solid, medium-range bomber built to deliver payloads from 12,000 feet, steady and predictable. But to Grayson's mind, it was a blank canvas waiting for fury to take form. "They say it can't be done," he told McLeod one evening, tracing lines across the metal fuselage with chalk. "But that's because they've never been desperate enough to try." The first problem was balance. Adding forward-facing guns to a bomber meant adding weight to the nose, shifting the center of gravity so far forward that the aircraft could become uncontrollable. Every gun had recoil, every bullet a push backward equal to the force of its flight. Multiply that by thousands of rounds per minute, and even steel could twist. Yet Grayson saw opportunity in what others called danger. He reinforced the nose with thick aluminum plates salvaged from wrecked bombers, built mounting brackets by hand, and installed shock absorbers scavenged from ground vehicles to counter recoil. He didn't wait for blueprints. He made them as he went, sketching diagrams on toolboxes, crates, even the floor of the hangar. The work was exhausting, endless, and dangerous. Men worked without sleep, welding until their faces shone with sweat and metal dust. The sound of hammers and engines echoed across the airfield day and night. The Australians joked that Grayson was trying to outfight the sun itself. Within a week, the first B-25 conversion was ready. The transparent nose was gone, replaced with a jagged shell of metal that gleamed like armor. 8 Browning .50 caliber machine guns were fixed in the nose, 4 more in side blisters, and 2 in the dorsal turret. 14 guns, all pointing forward, a flying fortress that didn't just drop bombs but delivered storms of bullets. Each gun could fire 850 rounds a minute. Together, they spat nearly 200 rounds every second, a cone of lead dense enough to tear through steel and wood alike. The mechanics called it Grayson's Dragon, a name that stuck. When Kennerly came to inspect it, he simply stared, his hands on his hips. "You've just built a machine that eats its own recoil," he muttered. Grayson smiled. "Then we'll feed it plenty." The first test flight was brutal. The B-25 lurched down the runway, nose heavy, sluggish, and angry. Grayson took the controls himself, feeling the plane fight him every inch of the way. It barely cleared the trees, the engines howling in protest. At 500 feet, he pulled the trigger. The guns roared as one, the entire airframe shuddering like it had been struck by lightning. Loose rivets popped, the cockpit filled with smoke. Yet through it all, Grayson laughed. The plane was alive. Barely, but alive. When he landed, one of the crew chiefs ran up to him, shouting over the engines, "You almost shook the wings off." Grayson climbed down, wiped soot from his face, and said quietly, "Then we'll build them stronger." And he did. Every test taught him something new. How to brace the fuselage, how to feed ammunition without jamming, how to align gunfire so tightly that the rounds converged on a single point. His hangar turned into a living organism of experimentation. Guns were moved, mounts rewelded, armor reshaped. It was messy, dangerous, and revolutionary. The official engineers back in California called it reckless. The pilots who flew in New Guinea called it hope. By late 1942, Grayson's modified B-25s were ready. They weren't just bombers anymore. They were predators built for the Pacific jungle. Their crews trained to skim treetops, to attack at wave-top height, to strike so fast the enemy barely had time to aim. And behind every new aircraft stood Grayson, the blacksmith's son who refused to let textbooks dictate survival. "Impossible doesn't fly," he liked to say. "This will." The results came quickly. In small raids across the Solomon Islands, his B-25s cut through Japanese outposts with terrifying precision. Supply ships burst into flames, airfields went silent, and entire convoys vanished under the weight of concentrated firepower. Pilots returned shaking, half in disbelief at what they'd unleashed. "You pointed at something," one of them said, "and it just disappears." Kennerly sent word to higher command. Grayson's modifications worked. They weren't experiments anymore. They were weapons of war. The requests multiplied. Every squadron wanted a strafer. Airfields in Townsville became assembly lines of innovation, turning standard bombers into steel predators. But Grayson wasn't celebrating. He knew what was coming. The Japanese were building up for a massive push toward New Guinea. Their convoys thicker, their escorts stronger. Intelligence reports warned of an armada preparing to move. Grayson spent his nights at the edge of the runway, smoking in silence, listening to the sound of his modified planes taking off into the dark. He knew they were ready, but he also knew they hadn't yet been truly tested. For all their power, for all their fire, the real measure of his creation would come in one battle, one storm of sea and fire that would either validate his defiance or bury it beneath the waves. Now all he needed was a battle big enough to prove that his creation wasn't madness. It was evolution. That moment arrived sooner than anyone expected. In early March of 1943, Allied intelligence intercepted radio chatter from Rabaul, a stronghold of the Japanese Empire. A massive convoy had assembled. 8 transports carrying 7,000 troops and supplies, escorted by 8 destroyers. Their destination, Lae, New Guinea, a crucial foothold for Japan's defense of the South Pacific. If they made landfall, the Allied campaign could stall for months, maybe longer. When the report reached General George Kennerly's desk, he didn't hesitate. "If those ships reach Lae," he said quietly, "men will die for a year because we failed this week." He turned to Grayson. "You've got your battle." The airfields of New Guinea buzzed with life as crews armed and fueled their planes. For 3 days, bad weather cloaked the region, giving the Japanese a false sense of safety. On the morning of March 3rd, the skies cleared. Through gaps in the clouds, the sea below glimmered like polished metal. Calm, deceptive, waiting. Major Jack Grayson stood beside the flight line, watching his B-25 strafers roar to life. Their noses glistened with gun barrels. Their bellies carried 500-pound bombs. These weren't bombers anymore. They were predators. "Stay low," he told the pilots. "Close enough to touch the sea. If you can see the whites of their eyes, you're doing it right." Then he watched them take off one by one, until the horizon shimmered with the heat of their exhaust. The Battle of the Bismarck Sea began with thunder. The Japanese convoy, sailing south through the Solomon Sea, moved in tight formation. Smoke curled from their funnels, their decks bristling with anti-aircraft guns. From the east came the first wave, Grayson's B-25s, streaking across the water so low their propellers sliced the crests of the waves. On radar, they barely existed. The enemy lookouts shouted warnings too late. Within seconds, the sky exploded. The first strafers opened fire, 14 guns each unleashing a storm of 50-caliber rounds. The noise was not a rhythm, but a roar. A solid wall of sound and heat. Armor plates shattered. Gun crews fell where they stood. Bridges turned to splinters. The transport's decks erupted in sparks and smoke. The Japanese formation scattered in panic. Their once disciplined columns reduced to chaos. Behind the strafers came the second wave, conventional bombers flying higher, dropping their loads at shallow angles. Their bombs skipped across the water like thrown stones, slamming into hulls just below the waterline. The explosions rolled across the sea, lifting ships out of the water before splitting them apart. Within minutes, the convoy was a graveyard of flame. The pilots who survived the first runs described it later as flying through a world that stopped making sense. The air was thick with smoke and debris, tracer fire streaking past the windows like comets. One B-25 took a direct hit to its wing. The pilot held course long enough to release his bombs before spinning into the ocean. Another came home with both engines bleeding oil and bullet holes across the fuselage, the gun barrels glowing red from overuse. Yet the damage inflicted was catastrophic. Grayson's innovation had done more than destroy ships. It had paralyzed an army. Over the course of 3 days, the sea itself seemed to burn. Allied aircraft attacked relentlessly, denying rescue attempts, forcing survivors to cling to wreckage as oil fires consumed the waves. When it was over, 8 transports and 4 destroyers lay beneath the water. Thousands of Japanese soldiers went down with them, their supplies and weapons lost forever. Fewer than 1,000 made it to shore, and those who did were too weak to fight. Allied losses, 4 aircraft, 13 men. The rest returned home to silence, too stunned to celebrate. When the reports came in, General Kennerly called it the most one-sided victory in the history of naval air power. But for Grayson, victory was never about statistics. Standing at the end of the runway, he listened to the returning engines and felt the weight of what they'd done. He'd proven that his creation worked, brutally, undeniably. The B-25 strafer had rewritten the book on air warfare. Yet, beneath the roar of celebration, a different noise filled his mind. The sound of breaking glass, of his wife's voice fading on the radio months ago. Every ship that sank felt like a step closer to her, and yet, somehow, further from peace. That night, he walked alone through the hangar, past the blackened shells of returning planes, past bullet holes that traced the outline of survival. He touched the side of one B-25, still warm from flight, and whispered, "We did it." The metal didn't answer. It never did. Word of the battle spread across the Pacific. Crews began calling the modified Mitchells Grayson's monsters. Photographs of the burning convoy reached Washington, and suddenly, the impossible became doctrine. North American aviation requested schematics of the conversions. New factories prepared to build B-25s with fixed guns straight from the assembly line. For the first time, official orders bore Grayson's name, but he didn't smile when he read them. He only looked toward the east, toward the invisible line where the Pacific met the horizon, where his family still waited behind barbed wire. "We sank their ships," he told McLeod quietly, "but I still can't reach my own." McLeod didn't answer. There was nothing to say. The battle had proven everything they set out to prove. That innovation born of fury could change the course of a war, but victory always comes with a price. And for Grayson, the bill was coming due. Behind every triumph lay a cost, and Grayson was about to pay his. After the Battle of the Bismarck Sea, the world around him changed overnight. The headlines praised the flying fortresses of fire, and photographs of burning ships spread across newspapers like trophies of ingenuity. But Jack Grayson didn't feel like a hero. The men under his command celebrated, but he walked among them silent, eyes dark with exhaustion. Every time someone called his modified B-25 a miracle, he thought of the faces in those ships, the men on the other side who had gone down into the sea. To most, he was the blacksmith's son who outsmarted the enemy. To himself, he was a man still chasing ghosts through smoke and salt water. The victory had given him fame, but not peace. In the weeks after Bismarck, Grayson threw himself into work. He supervised every conversion, flew on test runs, and personally inspected aircraft before they left for combat. He pushed himself beyond exhaustion, running on coffee, cigarettes, and guilt. "If I stop," he told McLeod one evening, "I start thinking, and that's worse." The factory-like chaos of the Townsville Air Depot became his refuge. The clatter of wrenches, the hiss of torches, and the rhythmic hammering of rivets drowned out the noise inside his head. Each new gun mounted on a plane felt like armor against helplessness. But even steel couldn't keep out the news that came one morning in 1944. An intercepted radio message reported that Japanese aircraft had bombed near Santo Tomas. The camp where his wife and children were held was among the targets. The message gave no details, no names, just coordinates and casualty numbers. Grayson stared at the paper for a long time before folding it carefully and putting it in his pocket. He didn't speak of it for days. When McLeod finally asked, Grayson's reply was almost a whisper. "Maybe they're gone. Maybe this is all I have left, the fight." From that day, he flew every mission he could. He volunteered for sorties others avoided, flying through storms and flak like a man with nothing left to lose. Crews who served with him said his eyes were distant in the cockpit, calm in a way that made them uneasy. "He flew like he was already halfway gone," one pilot remembered. During a raid over the Philippines, his B-25 took ground fire that shredded the left engine. Smoke poured into the cockpit. Grayson ordered the crew to bail out, but they refused. He managed to bring the plane back, landing on one engine, metal screaming. When they climbed out, his flight suit was soaked with blood from a shrapnel wound he hadn't even mentioned. It was his 5th injury of the war. 4 more would follow. The medals began to pile up. Distinguished flying crosses, silver stars, purple hearts, each one another reminder of how much he'd given. But medals couldn't fill the silence that waited for him after every mission. He spent nights alone in the hangar, sitting beside the empty planes, listening to the ticking of cooling engines. Sometimes he'd trace the outline of his family's names carved on a small piece of metal he kept in his pocket. He had made it himself from the fragment of a downed bomber. "For luck," he once told McLeod, "or for memory. Depends on the day." In late 1944, the war began to shift. American forces returned to the Philippines, inching closer to Manila. Grayson insisted on joining the campaign despite his injuries. Against orders, he flew a low-level attack during a Japanese counterstrike on Leyte. Anti-aircraft shells burst around him like thunder. One exploded near his plane, tearing through the fuselage. He was thrown against the controls, the world spinning in a blur of light and smoke. Somehow, he crash-landed on the shoreline, half-conscious, blood seeping through his uniform. When they pulled him from the wreckage, his first words were not about pain or medals. "Did we hit the target?" he asked. The medics nodded. He smiled faintly. "Good. Then I can rest." They sent him home after that, grounded, bandaged, and unwilling. The man who had once flown through fire now sat in a hospital bed staring out at the sea, wondering what parts of himself he had traded for the machines he built. In February 1945, the battle for Manila reached its breaking point. American and Filipino forces fought street by street to free the city. On February 3rd, after 3 years in captivity, the gates of Santo Tomas finally fell. Among the 3,000 survivors were Clara Grayson and the 4 children Jack had feared dead. When word reached him, he wept for the first time in years, not out of joy alone but from the unbearable weight of relief. The war that had begun with silence ended in reunion. When he finally held them again, his wife's face was pale and thin, her hands trembling. She looked at him as if seeing a stranger. "Did you find us?" she asked softly. He took her hand and whispered, "No, but I found a way to end it." For the rest of the evening, they didn't speak. They just sat together, the sound of the waves outside filling the space where words no longer fit. Peace, when it finally came, felt unreal. The world celebrated victory. But for men like Grayson, the war didn't end. It just changed shape. He was promoted, decorated, and sent to oversee production of his own designs. Yet every day he walked among the machines like a man visiting old ghosts. His body healed, but something inside him remained fractured. He had proven his theory, turned fury into engineering, and helped win a war. But in the quiet hours when the factories went still, he would stare at the blueprints and wonder if genius was just another name for guilt that never sleeps. The war would end, but Grayson's creation was just beginning its life, and it would outlive him by generations. In the first months after Japan's surrender, the airfields of the Pacific grew silent. The smell of gasoline and cordite faded, replaced by the sound of hammers rebuilding instead of destroying. Major Jack Grayson, now promoted to colonel, returned to the United States to oversee the design division at North American Aviation, the very company that had once doubted his ideas. He walked through vast assembly halls filled with rows of fresh B-25s gleaming under factory lights, their noses now solid metal, their gun mounts built straight from the drawings he had once scribbled on scrapwood in a tin hangar. Young engineers approached him like an icon, eager to learn how a field modification had changed the entire doctrine of air warfare. Grayson, with his hair graying at the temples and a slight limp from his wounds, spoke little of the war. "I just fixed what was broken," he told them. But those who knew him understood that what he had really done was fix the way America thought about flight itself. By 1946, production models of the B-25H and J variants rolled out of the plant, machines already born with the fury he had once welded by hand. The 75mm cannon, the multiple gun packages, the side blisters, all of it had roots in the desperate experiments of Queensland. To the pilots who flew them, these aircraft were not just machines. They were armor-plated proof that necessity could outthink bureaucracy. And yet Grayson remained restless. He spent long nights at his drafting table, staring at new blueprints that no one had asked him to draw, concepts for heavier firepower, faster mounts, and sleeker wings. He wasn't chasing glory anymore. He was chasing understanding. How far could you push an idea before it stopped being survival and started becoming obsession? In the years that followed, he returned to the Philippines with his family to help rebuild the airline he had once founded before the war. The islands were scarred but breathing again, the runways reborn from rubble. Locals still remembered the American pilot who had flown through storms and fire. To them, Grayson wasn't a soldier. He was the man who had proven that machines could carry the human heart into battle and bring it back again. But peace didn't fit him easily. He flew transport routes, trained new pilots, and watched his children grow, but part of him remained somewhere over that burning sea. Those who met him in those years described a man both gentle and haunted, a craftsman who smiled often but never quite relaxed. He carried in his pocket a small, spent .50 caliber casing, one that had been fired from his first strafer. He called it a reminder of what anger can build and what it can destroy. In 1957, Grayson's life ended the way it had been lived, in the sky. During a routine charter flight over the Philippine Sea, a storm closed in without warning. His Beechcraft vanished from radar, found days later on a remote mountainside. There were no survivors. He was 57 years old. The news spread quietly at first, then widely, and for those who had flown with him, it felt as if a chapter of the war had finally closed. At his funeral, veterans from across the Pacific gathered to honor him. Some brought medals, others brought photographs. One pilot placed an empty shell casing on the casket and whispered, "He taught us that fear could be engineered into courage." It was a simple gesture, but it carried the weight of everything Grayson had stood for. Yet his legacy refused to fade. 2 decades later, as another generation of young American engineers faced a different kind of war in the jungles of Vietnam, they studied the notes and field reports written in Grayson's hand. His principles, concentrated forward firepower, low-altitude engagement, and close air support, became the foundation for a new breed of aircraft. The AC-47 Spooky gunship took to the skies, followed by the AC-130 Spectre, bristling with cannons and sensors. Inside those planes, technology had evolved, but the spirit remained the same. Every time the gunships circled above a battlefield, unleashing precision fire to protect the soldiers below, they carried the DNA of Grayson's idea. That power, when guided by necessity and tempered by conscience, could change the outcome of a war. In the official histories, his name appeared only in passing, a footnote under technical development. But among pilots and engineers, he was spoken of in quiet reverence. They called him the man who made bombers fight back. At air shows and reunions, veterans would tell younger flyers about the day the Bismarck Sea caught fire, about the blacksmith's son from Arkansas who dared to weld defiance into steel. He wasn't trying to be a hero, one of them said years later. He just wanted to get home. The passage of time polished his story into legend. Museums displayed his modified nose designs, while engineers traced the lineage of every gunship back to that single hangar in Queensland. Even the Air Force's training manuals on aerial support included a quiet acknowledgement that innovation in battle is often born not from orders, but from heartbreak. Decades after his death, visiting pilots at the military cemetery in Manila still left offerings at his grave. Small brass casings lined neatly along the edge of the stone, glinting in the sunlight like silent salutes. Each one marked not just the bullets he fired, but the lessons he left behind. In the end, Grayson's greatest creation wasn't a machine at all. It was a way of thinking, a reminder that invention is not about defiance for its own sake, but about refusing to accept limits when lives depend on it. The hangars of Queensland are long gone, swallowed by time and vegetation. But on quiet mornings when the wind crosses the empty field, it still carries a faint echo of engines, of metal striking metal, of a man muttering to himself beneath his breath, "If we can't bomb them from above, we'll burn them from below." From a father's fury to a nation's firepower, Major Jack "Pappy" Grayson proved that even in war, the most powerful weapon is imagination.